Good evening, and welcome to Twilight Tales by Living Well and Wild, a series of fantasy bedtime stories for grown-ups. My name is Alexis, and I will be the narrator for your transition from the busy day to a comfortable and restorative slumber. I invite you to make yourself comfortable as we first settle in to a 2-1 breathing pattern. Practicing the 2-1 breathing technique before sleep can have beneficial effects on overall well-being by promoting relaxation and reducing anxiety. We will start by moving into an even inhale-exhale pattern. Begin with an inhale of 4 and an exhale of 4. Continue this pattern. Inhale 4, exhale 4 for the next few breaths. Inhale 4, exhale 4. Now we are going to adjust our breathing to achieve the 2-1 ratio. This simply means that your exhales are going to be twice as long as your inhales. I am going to use a 3-count inhale and 6-count exhale, but I encourage you to use whatever 2-1 pattern you are comfortable with. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Really focus on deepening the exhalation, pushing out all that additional air. Inhale 3, exhale 6. Take a few moments to settle into these breaths. Chapter 16. Orion hunts the stag. There passed 10 years over the fields we know, and Orion grew and learned the art of oath, and had the cunning of thrall, and knew the woods and the slopes and the vales of the downs, as many another boy knows how to multiply figures by other figures, or to draw the thoughts from a language not his own, and to set them down again in words of his own tongue. And little he knew of the things that ink may do, how it can mark a dead man's thought for the wonder of later years, and tell of happenings that are gone clean away, and be a voice for us out of the dark of time, and save many a fragile thing from the pounding of heavy ages, or carry to us over the rolling centuries even a song from lips long dead on forgotten hills. Little knew he of ink, but the touch of a roe deer's feet on dry ground, gone 3 hours, was a clear path to him, and nothing went through the woods but Orion read its story. And all the sounds of the wood were as full of clear meaning to him as are to the mathematician the signs and figures he makes when he divides his millions by tens and elevens and twelves. He knew by sun and moon and wind what birds would enter the wood. He knew of the coming seasons, whether they would be mild or severe, only a little later than the beasts of the wood themselves, which have not human reason or soul, and that know so much more than we. And so he grew to know the very mood of the woods, and could enter their shadowy shelter like one of the woodland beasts. And this he could do when he was barely 14 years. And many a man lives all his years and can never enter a wood without changing the whole mood of its shadowy ways. For men enter a wood perhaps with the wind behind them. They brush against branches, step on twigs, speak, smoke, or tread heavily, and jays cry out against them. Pigeons leave the trees, rabbits pad off to safety, and far more beasts than they know slip on soft feet away from their coming. But Orion moved like Threll, in shoes of deer skin with the tread of a hunter, and none of the beasts of the wood knew when he was come. And he came to have a pile of skins like Oth, that he won with his bow in the wood, and he hung great horns of stags in the hall of the castle, high up among old horns where the spider had lived for ages. And this was one of the signs whereby the people of Earl came to know him now for their lord, for no news came of Alveric, and all the old lords of Earl had been hunters of deer. And another sign was the departing of the witch Zerundarel when she went back to her hill. And Orion lived in the castle now by himself, and she dwelt in her cottage again, where her cabbages grew on the high land near to the thunder. And all that winter Orion hunted the stags in the wood, but when spring came he put his bow away. Yet all through the season of song and flowers his thoughts were still with the chase. And he went from house to house wherever a man had one of the long, thin dogs that hunt. And sometimes he bought the dog, and sometimes the man would promise to lend it on days of hunting. Thus Orion formed a pack of brown, long-haired hounds, and yearned for the spring and summer to go by. And one spring evening, when Orion was tending his hounds, when villagers were mostly at their doors to notice the length of the evening, there came a man up the street whom nobody knew. He came from the uplands, wrapped in the most aged of clothes, which clung to him as though they had clung forever, and were somehow a part of him and yet part of the earth, for they were mellowed by the clay of the high fields to its own deep brown. And folk noticed the easy stride of a mighty walker, and a weariness in his eyes, and none knew who he was. And then a woman said, "It is Vand that was only a lad." And they all crowded about him then, for it was indeed Vand who had left the sheep more than 10 years ago to ride with Alveric, no one in Earl knew whither. "How fares our master?" they said, and a look of weariness came in the eyes of Vand. "He follows the quest," he said. "Whither?" they asked. "To the north," he said. "He seeks for Elfland still." "Why have you left him?" they asked. "I lost the hope," he said. They questioned him no more then, for all men knew that to seek for Elfland one needed a strong hope, and without it one saw no gleam of the elfin mountains, serene with unchanging blue. And then the mother of Niv came running up. "Is it indeed Vand?" she said. And they all said, "Yes, it is Vand." And while they murmured together about Vand, and of how years and wandering had changed him, she said to him, "Tell me of my son. And Vand replied, "He leads the quest. There is none whom my master trusts more." And they all wondered, and yet they had no cause for wonder, for it was a mad quest. But Niv's mother alone did not wonder. "I knew he would," she said. "I knew he would." And she was filled with great content. There are events and seasons to suit the mood of every man, though few indeed could have suited the crazed mood of Niv. Yet there came Alveric's quest for Elfland, and so Niv found his work. And talking in the late evening with Vand, the folk of Earl heard tales of many camps, many marches, a tale of profitless wandering, where Alveric haunted horizons year after year like a ghost. And sometimes out of Van's sadness that had come from those profitless years, a smile would shine as he told of some foolish happening that had taken place in the camp. But all was told by one that had lost hope in the quest. This was not the way to tell of it, not with doubts, not with smiles. For such a quest may only be told of by those who are fired by its glory. From the mad brain of Niv, or the moonstruck wits of Zend, we might have news of that quest, which could light our minds with some gleam of its meaning. But never from the story, be it made out of facts or scoffs, told by one whom the quest itself was able to lure no longer. The stars stole out, and still Vand was telling his stories, and one by one the people went back to their houses, caring to hear no more of the hopeless quest. Had the tale been told by one who clung yet to the faith that still was leading Alveric's wanderers on, the stars would have weakened before those folks left the teller. The sky would have brightened so widely before they left him that one would have said at last, "Why, it is morning." Not till then would they have gone. And the next day Vand went back to the downs and the sheep and troubled himself with romantic quests no more. And during that spring men spoke of Alveric again, wondering a while at his quest, speaking a while of Lirazel, and guessing where she had gone, and guessing why. And where they could not guess, telling some tale to explain all, which went from mouth to mouth till they came to believe it. And spring went by, and they forgot Alveric, and obeyed the will of Orion. And then one day, as Orion was waiting for the summer to go by, with his heart on frosty days, and his dreams with his hounds on the uplands, Rannoch the lover came over the downs by the path by which Vand had come, and walked down into Earl. Rannoch with his heart free at last, with all his melancholy gone, Rannoch without woe, careless, carefree, content, looking only for rest after his long wandering, sighing no more. And nothing but this would have made Viria care to have him, the girl he had sought once. So the end of this was that she married him, and he too went roaming no more on fantastic quests. And though some looked to the uplands through many an evening, till the long days wore away, and a strange wind touched the leaves, and some peered over the further caves of the downs, yet they saw none more of the followers of Alveric's quest coming back by the path that Vand and Rannoch had trod. And by the time that the leaves were a wonder of scarlet and gold, men spoke no more of Alveric, but obeyed Orion his son. And in this season Orion arose one day before dawn, and took his horn and his bow, and went to his hounds, who wondered to hear his step before light was come. They heard it all in their sleep, and awoke and clamored to him. And he loosed them and calmed them and led them away to the downs. And to the lonely magnificence of the downs they came when the stags are feeding on dewy grasses, before men are awake. All in the wild, wet morning they ran over the gleaming slopes, Orion and his hounds all rejoicing together. And the scent of the thyme came heavy with the air that Orion breathed, as he trod its wide patches blooming late in the year. To the hounds there came all the wandering scents of the morning, and what wild creatures had met on the hill in the dark, and what had crossed it going upon their journeys, and whither all had gone when the day grew bright, bringing the threat of man. Orion guessed and wondered, but to the hounds all was clear, and some of the scents they noted with careful noses, and some they scorned, and for one they sought in vain, for the great red deer were not on the downs that morning. And Orion led them far from the Vale of Earl, but saw no stag that day, and never a wind brought the scent that the anxious hounds were seeking, nor could they find it hidden in any grass or leaves. And evening came on him, bringing his hounds home, calling on stragglers with his horn, while the sun turned huge and scarlet, and fainter than echoes of his horn, and far beyond downs and mist, but clear each silver note, he heard the elfin horns that called to him always at evening. With the great comradeship of a common weariness, he and his hounds came home dark in the starlight. The windows of Earl at last flashed to them the glow of their welcome. Hounds came to their kennels and ate, and lay down to contented sleep. Orion went to his castle. He too ate, and afterwards sat thinking of the downs and his hounds and the day, his mind lulled by fatigue to the point at which it rests beyond care. And many a day passed thus, and then one dewy morning, coming over a ridge of the downs, they saw a stag below them feeding late when all the rest were gone. The hounds all broke into one joyous cry. The heavy stag moved nimbly over the grass. Orion shot an arrow and missed. All these things happened in a moment. And then the hounds streamed away, and the wind went over the backs of them with a ripple, and the stag went away as though every one of his feet were on little dancing springs. And at first the hounds were swifter than Orion, but he was as tireless as they, and by taking sometimes shorter ways than theirs, he stayed near them till they came to a stream and faltered, and began to need the help of human reason. And such help as human reason can give in such a matter Orion gave them, and soon they were on again. And the morning passed as they went from hill to hill, and they had not seen the stag a second time. And the afternoon wore away, and still the hounds followed every step of the stag with a skill as strange as magic. And towards evening Orion saw him, going slowly along the slope of a hill, over coarse grass that was shining in the rays of the low sun. He cheered on his hounds, and they ran him over 3 more small valleys, but down at the bottom of the third, he turned round amongst the pebbles of a stream and waited there for the hounds. And they came baying round him, watching his brow antlers. And there they tore him down and killed him at sunset. And Orion wound his horn with a great joy in his heart. He wanted no more than this. And with a note like that of joy, as though they also rejoiced, or mocked his rejoicing, over hills that he knew not, perhaps from the far side of the sunset, the horns of Elfland answered. Chapter 17. The Unicorn Comes in the Starlight. And winter came, and whitened the roofs of Earl, and all the forest and uplands. And when Orion took his hounds afield in the morning, the world lay like a book that was newly written by life. for all the story of the night before lay in long lines in the snow. Here the fox had gone, and there the badger, and here the red deer had gone out of the wood. The tracks led over the downs and disappeared from sight, as the deeds of statesmen, soldiers, courtiers, and politicians appear and disappear on the pages of history. Even the birds had their record on those white downs, where the eye could follow each step of their treble claws, till suddenly on each side of the track would appear 3 little scars where the tips of their longest feathers had flicked the snow, and there the track faded utterly. They were like some popular cry, some vehement fancy that comes down on a page of history for a day and passes, leaving no other record at all except those lines on one page. And amongst all these records left of the story of night, Orion would choose the track of some great stag not too long gone, and would follow it with his hounds away over the downs until even the sound of his horn could be heard no longer in Earl. And over a ridge with his hounds, he and they all black against red remnants of sunset, the folk of Earl would see him coming home. And often it was not until all the stars were glowing through the frost. Often the skin of a red deer hung over his shoulders, and the huge horns bobbed and nodded above his head. And at this time there met one day in the forge of Gnarl, all unknown to Orion, the men of the Parliament of Earl. They met after sunset when all were home from their work, and gravely Gnarl handed to each the mead that was brewed from the clover honey. And when all were come, they sat silent. And then Gnarl broke the silence, saying that Alveric ruled over Earl no more, and his son was lord of Earl, and telling again how once they had hoped for a magic lord to rule over the valley and to make it famous, and saying that this should be he. And where now, he said, is the magic for which we hoped? For he hunts the deer as all his forefathers hunted, and nothing of magic has touched him from over there, and there is no new thing. And Oth stood up to defend him. He is as fleet as his hounds, he said, and hunts from dawn to sunset, and crosses the furthest downs, and comes home untired. It is but youth, said Guhic, and so said all but Threll. And Threll stood up and said, he has a knowledge of the ways of the woods, and the lore of the beasts, beyond the learning of man. You taught him, said Guhic. There is no magic here. Nothing of this, said Gnarl, is from over there. Thus they argued a while, lamenting the loss of the magic for which they had hoped. For never a valley but history touches it once. Never a village but once its name is a while on the lips of men. Only the village of Earl was utterly unrecorded. Never a century knew it beyond the round of its downs. And now all their plans seemed lost, which they made so long ago, and they saw no hope except in the mead that was brewed from the clover honey. To this they turned in silence. Now it was a goodly brew. And in a while new plans flashed clear in their minds, new schemes, new devices, and debates in the Parliament of Earl flowed proudly on. And they would have made a plan and a policy, but Oth arose from his seat. There was in a flint-built house in the village of Earl an ancient chronicle, a volume bound in leather, and in it at certain seasons folk wrote all manner of things, the wisdom of farmers concerning the time to sow, the wisdom of hunters concerning the tracking of stags, and the wisdom of prophets that told of the way of earth. From this Oth quoted now 2 lines that he remembered on one of the aged pages, and all the rest of that page told of hoeing, These lines he said to the Parliament of Earl as they sat with the mead before them at their table. Hooded and veiled with their night-like tresses, the fates shall bring what no prophet guesses. And then they planned no more, for either their minds were calmed by a certain awe that they seemed to find in the lines, or it may be the mead was stronger than anything written in books. However it be, they sat silent over their mead, and in early starlight, while the west still glowed, they passed away from Gnarl's house, back to their own homes, grumbling as they went that they had no magic lord to rule over Earl, and yearning for magic, to save from oblivion the village and valley they loved. They parted one by one as they came to their houses, and 3 or 4 that dwelt near the end of the village on the side that was under the downs were not yet come to their doors, when, white and clear in the starlight and what remained of the gloaming, they saw, hard-pressed and wearied, a hunted unicorn coming across the downs. They stopped and gazed and shaded their eyes and stroked their beards and wondered. And still it was a white unicorn galloping wearily, and then they heard drawing nearer the cry of Orion's hounds. Chapter 18. The Grey Tent in the Evening. On the day that the hunted unicorn crossed the Valley of Earl, Alveric had wandered for over 11 years. For more than 10 years, a company of 6, they went by the backs of the houses by the edge of the fields we know, and camped at evenings with their queer material hung grayly on poles. And whether or not the strange romance of their quest mirrored itself in all the things about them, those camps of theirs seemed always the strangest thing in the landscape. And as evening grew grayer around them, their romance and mystery grew. And for all the vehemence of Alveric's ambition, they traveled leisurely and lazily. Sometimes in a pleasant camp they stayed for 3 days. Then they went strolling on. 9 or 10 miles they would march, and then they would camp again. Someday, Alveric felt sure in his heart, they would see that border of twilight. Someday they would enter Elfland. And in Elfland he knew that time was not as here. He would meet Lirazel unaged in Elfland, with never one smile lost to the raging years, never a furrow worn by the ruin of time. This was his hope, and it led his queer company on from camp to camp, and cheered them round the fire in the lonely evenings, and brought them far to the north, traveling all along the edge of the fields we know, where all men's faces turned the other way, and the 6 wanderers went unseen and unheeded. Only the mind of Vand hung back from their hope, and more every year his reason denied the lure that was leading the rest. And then one day he lost his faith in Elfland. After that he only followed until a day when the wind was full of rain, and all were cold and wet and the horses weary. He left them then. And Rannoch followed because he had no hope in his heart, and wished to wander from sorrow, until one day when all the blackbirds were singing in trees of the fields we know, and his hopelessness left him in the glittering sunshine, and he thought of the cozy homes and the haunts of men. And soon he too passed out of the camp one evening and set off for the pleasant lands. And now the 4 that were left were all of one mind, and under the wet, coarse cloth that they hung on poles, there was deep content in the evenings. For Alveric clung to his hope with all the strength of his race, that had once won Earl in old battles and held it for centuries long. And in the vacant minds of Niv and Zend this idea grew strong and big, like some rare flower that a gardener may plant by chance in a wild, untended place. And Thil sung of the hope, and all his wild fancies that roamed after song decked Alveric's quest with more and more of glamour, so all were of one mind. And greater quests, whether mad or sane, have prospered when this was so, and greater quests have failed when it was otherwise. They had gone northwards for years along the backs of those houses, and then one day they would turn eastwards, wherever a certain look in the sky, or a touch of weirdness at evening, or a mere prophecy of Niv's, seemed to suggest a proximity of Elfland. Upon such occasions they would travel over the rocks that for all those years lay bordering the fields we know, until Alveric saw that provisions for men and horses would barely bring them back to the houses of men. Then he would turn again, but Niv would have led them still onward over the rocks, for his enthusiasm grew as they went. And Thil sang to them, prophesizing success, and Zend would say that he saw the peaks and the spires of Elfland. Only Alveric was wise. And so they would come to the houses of men again and buy more provisions. And Niv and Zend and Thil would babble of the quest, pouring out the enthusiasm that burned in their hearts. But Alveric did not speak of it, for he had learned that men in those fields neither speak of nor look towards Elfland, although he had not learned why. Soon they were on again, and the folk that had sold them the produce of fields we know gazed curiously after them as they went, as though they thought that from madness alone, or from dreams inspired by the moon, came all the talk they had heard from Niv and Zend and Thil. Thus they always traveled on, always seeking new points from which to discover Elfland. And on the left of them blew scents from the fields we know, the scent of lilac from cottage gardens in May, and then the scent of the white thorn, and then of roses, till all the air was heavy with new-mown hay. They heard the low of cattle away on their left, heard human voices, heard partridges calling, heard all the sounds that go up from happy farms. And on their right was always the desolate land, always the rocks, and never grass nor a flower. They had the companionship of men no more, and yet they could not find Elfland. In such a case they needed the songs of Thil and the sure hope of Niv. And the talk of Alveric's quest spread through the land and overtook his wanderings, till all men that he passed by knew his story, and from some he had the contempt that some men give to those who dedicate all their days to a quest, and from others he had honor. But all he asked for was provender, and this he bought when they brought it. So they went on. Like legendary things, they passed along the backs of the houses, putting up their gray, shapeless tent in the gray evenings. They came as quietly as rain, and went away like mist drifting. There were jests about them and songs, and the songs outlasted the jests. At last they became a legend, which haunted those farms forever. They were spoken of when men told of hopeless quests, and held up to laughter or glory, whichever men had to give. And all the while the King of Elfland watched, for he knew by magic when Alveric's sword drew near. It had troubled his kingdom once, and the King of Elfland knew well the flavor of thunderbolt iron when he felt it loom on the air. From this he had withdrawn his frontiers far, leaving all that ragged land deserted of Elfland. And though he knew not the length of human journeys, he had left a space that to cross would weary the comet, and rightly deemed himself safe. But when Alveric with his sword was far to the north, the Elf King loosened the grip with which he had withdrawn Elfland, as the moon that withdraws the tide lets it flow back again, and Elfland came racing back as the tide over flat sands. With a long ribbon of twilight at its edge, it floated back over the waste of rocks. With old songs it came, with old dreams, and with old voices. And in a while the frontier of twilight lay flashing and glimmering near the fields we know, like an endless summer evening that lingered on out of the golden age. But bleak and far to the north, where Alveric wandered, the limitless rocks still heaped the desolate land. Only to fields from which he and his sword and his adventurous band were remotely gone, that mighty inlet of Elfland came lapping back. So that close again to the leather worker's cottage and to the farms of his neighbors, a bare 3 fields away, lay the land that was heaped and piled with all the wonder for which poets seek so hard, the very treasury of all romantic things. And the elfin mountains gazed over the border serenely, as though their pale blue peaks had never moved. And here the unicorns fed along the border as it was their custom to do, feeding sometimes in Elfland, which is the home of all fabulous things, cropping lilies below the slopes of the elfin mountains, and sometimes slipping through the border of twilight at evening, when all our fields are still, to feed upon earthly grass. It is because of this craving for earthly grass that comes on them now and then, as the red deer in highland mountains crave once a year for the sea, that, fabulous though they are on account of their birth in Elfland, their existence is nevertheless known among men. The fox, which is born in our fields, also crosses the frontier, going into the border of twilight at certain seasons. It is thence that he gets the romance with which he comes back to our fields. He also is fabulous, but only in Elfland, as the unicorns are fabulous here. And seldom the folk on those farms saw the unicorns, even dim in the gloaming, for their faces were turned forever away from Elfland. The wonder, the beauty, the glamour, the story of Elfland were for minds that had leisure to care for such things as these. But the crops needed these men, and the beasts that were not fabulous, and the thatch, and the hedges, and 1,000 things. Barely at the end of each year they won their fight against winter. They knew well that if they let a thought of theirs turn but for a moment towards Elfland, its glory would grip them soon and take all their leisure away, and there would be no time left to mend thatch, or hedge, or to plow the fields we know. But Orion, lured by the sound of the horns that blew from Elfland at evening, and that some elvish attuning of his ears to magical things caused him alone in all those fields to hear, came with his hounds to a field across which ran the frontier of twilight, and found the unicorns there late on an evening. And, slipping along a hedge of the little field with his hounds padding behind him, he came between a unicorn and the frontier and cut it off from Elfland. This was the unicorn that with flashing neck, covered with flecks of foam that shone silvery in the starlight, panting, harried and weary, came across the valley of Earl, like an inspiration, like a new dynasty to a custom-weary land, like news of happier continent found far off by suddenly returned seafaring men. Chapter 19. 12 Old Men Without Magic. Now, few things pass by a village and leave no talk behind them, nor did this unicorn. For the 3 that saw it going by in the starlight immediately told their families, and many of these ran from their houses to tell the good news to others, for all strange news was accounted good in Earl, because of the talk that it made. and talk was held to be needful when work was over to pass the evenings away. So they talked long of the unicorn. And, after a day or two, in the forge of Gnarl the Parliament of Earl was met again, seated by mugs of mead, discussing the unicorn. And some rejoiced and said that Orion was magic, because unicorns were of magic stock and came from beyond our fields. Therefore, said one, he has been to lands of which it does not become us to speak, and is magic, as all things are which dwell over there. And some agreed and held that their plans had come to fruition. But others said that the beast went by in the starlight, if beast it were, and who could say it was a unicorn? And one said that in the starlight it was hard to see it at all, and another said unicorns were hard to recognize. And then they began to discuss the size and shape of these beasts, and all the known legends that told of them, and came no nearer to agreeing together whether or not their lord had hunted a unicorn. Till at last Gnarl, seeing that they would not thus come by the truth, and deeming it necessary that the fact should be established one way or the other forever, rose up and told them that the time had come for the vote. So by a method they had of casting shells of various colors into a horn that was passed from man to man, they voted about the unicorn as Gnarl had commanded. And a hush fell, and Gnarl counted, and it was seen to have been established by vote that there had been no unicorn. Sorrowfully then that Parliament of Earls saw that their plans to have a magic lord had failed. They were all old men, and the hope that they had had for so long being gone, they turned less easily to newer plans than they had to the plan that they made so long ago. What should they do now, they said. How come by magic? What could they do that the world should remember Earl? 12 old men without magic. They sat there over their mead, and it could not lighten their sadness. But Orion was away with his hounds near that great inlet of Elfland, where it lay as it were at high tide, touching the very grass of the fields we know. He went there at evening when the horns blew clear to guide him, and waited there all quiet at the edge of those fields for the unicorns to steal across the border, for he hunted stags no more. And as he went over those fields in the late afternoon, folk working on the farms would greet him cheerily. But when still he went eastwards, they spoke to him less and less, till at last when he neared the border and still kept on, they looked his way no more, but left him and his hounds to their own devices. And by the time the sun set, he would be standing quiet by a hedge that ran right down into the frontier of Twilight, with his hounds all gathered close in under the hedge, with his eye on them all, lest one of them dared to move. And the pigeons would come home to the trees of the fields we know, and twittering starlings, and the elfin horns would blow, clear silver magical music thrilling the chilled air, and all the colors of clouds would go suddenly changing. It was then in the failing light, in the darkening of colors, that Orion would watch for a dim white shape stepping out of the border of Twilight. And this evening, just as he hushed a hound with his hand, just as all our fields went dim, there slipped a great white unicorn out of the border, still munching lilies such as never grew in any fields of ours. He came, a whiteness on perfectly silent feet, 4 or 5 yards into the fields we know, and stood there still as moonlight, and listened and listened and listened. Orion never moved, and he kept his hounds silent by some power he had, or by some wisdom of theirs. And in 5 minutes the unicorn made a step or two forward, and began to crop the long, sweet, earthly grasses. And as soon as he moved, there came others through the deep blue border of twilight, and all at once there were 5 of them feeding there. And still Orion stood with his hounds and waited. Little by little, the unicorns moved further away from the border, lured further and further into the fields we know by their deep, rich, earthly grasses, on which all 5 of them browsed in the silent evening. If a dog barked, even if a late cock crew, up went all their ears at once, and they stood watchful, not trusting anything in the fields of men, or venturing into them far. But at last the one that had come first through the twilight got so far from his magical home that Orion was able to run between him and the frontier, and his hounds came behind him. And then had Orion been toying with the chase, then had he hunted but for an idle whim, and not for that deep love of the huntsman's craft that only huntsmen know, then had he lost everything. For his hounds would have chased the nearest unicorns, and they would have been in a moment across the frontier and lost. And if the hounds had followed, they would have been lost too, and all that day's work would have gone for nothing. But Orion led his hounds to chase the furthest, watching all the while to see if any hound would try to pursue the others. And only one began to, but Orion's whip was ready. And so he cut his quarry off from its home, and his hounds for the second time were in full cry after a unicorn. As soon as the unicorn heard the feet of the hounds, and saw with one flash of his eye that he could not get to his enchanted home, he shot forward with a sudden spring of his limbs and went like an arrow over the fields we know. When he came to hedges, he did not seem to gather his limbs to leap, but seemed to glide over them with motionless muscles, galloping again when he touched the grass once more. In that first rush, the hounds drew far ahead of Orion, and this enabled him to head the unicorn off whenever it tried to turn to the magical land, and at such turnings he came near his hounds again. And the third time that Orion turned the unicorn, it galloped straight away, and so continued over the fields of men. The cry of the hounds went through the calm of the evening like a long ripple across a sleeping lake, following the unseen way of some strange diver. In that straight gallop, the unicorn gained so much on the hounds that soon Orion only saw him far off, a white spot moving along a slope in the gloaming. Then it reached the top of a valley and passed from view. But that strong, queer scent that led the hounds like a song remained clear on the grass, and they never checked or faltered except for a moment at streams. Even there, their ranging noses picked up the magical scent before Orion came up to give them his aid. And as the hunt went on, the daylight faded away, till the sky was all prepared for the coming of stars. And 1 or 2 stars appeared, and a mist came up from streams and spread all white over fields, till they could not have seen the unicorn if he had been but close before them. The very trees seemed sleeping. They passed by little houses, lonely, sheltered by elms, shut off by high hedges of yew from those that roamed the fields, houses that Orion had never seen or known till the chance course of this unicorn brought him suddenly past their doors. Dogs barked as they passed, and continued barking long, for that magical scent on the air and the rush and the voice of the pack told them something strange was afoot. And at first they barked because they would have shared in what was afoot, and afterwards to warn their masters about the strangeness. They barked long through the evening. And once, as they passed a little house in a cluster of old thorns, a door suddenly opened, and a woman stood gazing to see them go by. She could have seen no more than gray shapes, but Orion in the moment as he passed saw all the glow of the house and the yellow light streaming out into the cold. The merry warmth cheered him, and he would have rested a while in that little oasis of man in the lonely fields. But the hounds went on, and he followed. And those in the houses heard their cry go past like the sound of a trumpet whose echoes go fading away amongst the furthest hills. A fox heard them coming, and stood quite still and listened. At first he was puzzled. Then he caught the scent of the unicorn, and all was clear to him, for he knew by the magic flavor that it was something coming from Elfland. But when sheep caught the scent, they were terrified, and ran all huddled together until they could run no more. Cattle leaped up from their sleep, gazed dreamily, and wondered. But the unicorn went through them and away, as some rose-scented breeze that had strayed from valley gardens into the streets of a city slips through the noisy traffic and is gone. Soon all the stars were looking on those quiet fields through which the hunt went with its exultation, a line of vehement life cleaving through sleep and silence. And now the unicorn, far out of sight though he was, no longer gained a little at every hedge. For at first he lost no more pace at any hedge than a bird loses passing clear of a cloud, while the great hounds struggled through what gaps they could find, or lay on their sides and wriggled between the stems of the bushes. But now he gathered his strength with more effort at every hedge, and sometimes hit the top of the hedge and stumbled. He was galloping slower, too, for this was a journey such as no unicorn made through the deep calm of Elfland, and something told the tired hounds they were drawing nearer, and a new joy entered their voices. They crossed a few more black hedges, and then there loomed before them the dark of a wood. When the unicorn entered the wood, the voices of the hounds were clear in his ears. A pair of foxes saw him going slowly, and they ran along beside him to see what would befall the magic creature coming weary to them from Elfland. One on each side they ran, keeping his slow pace and watching him, and they had no fear of the hounds though they heard their cry, for they knew that nothing that followed that magical scent would turn aside after any earthly thing. So he went laboring through the wood, and the foxes watched him curiously all the way. The hounds entered the wood, and the great oaks rang with the sound of them, and Orion followed with an enduring speed that he may have got from our fields, or that may have come to him over the border from Elfland. The dark of the wood was intense, but he followed his hounds' cry, and they did not need to see with that wonderful scent to guide them. They never wavered as they followed that scent, but went on through gloaming and starlight. It was not like any hunt of fox or stag, for another fox will cross the line of a fox, or a stag may pass through a herd of stags and hinds. Even a flock of sheep will bewilder hounds by crossing the line they follow. But this unicorn was the only magical thing in all our fields that night, and his scent lay unmistakable over the earthly grass, a burning, pungent flavor of enchantment among the things of every day. They hunted him clear through the wood and down to a valley, the two foxes keeping with him and watching still. He picked his feet carefully as he went down the hill, as though his weight hurt them while he descended the slope. Yet his pace was as fast as that of the hounds going down. Then he went a little way along the trough of the valley, turning to his left as soon as he came down the hill, but the hounds gained on him then, and he turned for the opposite slope. And then his weariness could be concealed no longer, the thing that all wild creatures conceal to the last. He toiled over every step as though his legs dragged his body heavily. Orion saw him from the opposite slope. And when the unicorn got to the top, the hounds were close behind him, so that he suddenly whipped round his great single horn and stood before them, threatening. Then the hounds bayed about him, but the horn waved and bowed with such swift grace that no hound got a grip, They knew death when they saw it, and eager though they were to fasten upon him, they leaped back from that flashing horn. Then Orion came up with his bow, but he would not shoot, perhaps because it was hard to put an arrow safely past his pack of hounds, perhaps because of a feeling such as we have today, and which is no new thing among us, that it was unfair to the unicorn. Instead, he drew an old sword that he was wearing, and advanced through his hounds and engaged that deadly horn. And the unicorn arched his neck, and the horn flashed at Orion. And, weary though the unicorn was, yet a mighty force remained in that muscular neck to drive the blow that he aimed, and Orion barely parried. He thrust at the unicorn's throat, but the great horn tossed the sword aside from its aim and again lunged at Orion. Again he parried with the whole weight of his arm, and had but an inch to spare. He thrust again at the throat, and the unicorn parried the sword thrust almost contemptuously. Again and again the unicorn aimed fair at Orion's heart. The huge white beast stepped forward, pressing Orion back. That graceful, bowing neck, with its white arch of hard muscle driving the deadly horn, was wearying Orion's arm. Once more he thrust and failed. He saw the unicorn's eye flash wickedly in the starlight. He saw all white before him, the fearful arch of its neck. He knew he could turn aside its heavy blows no more. And then a hound got a grip in front of the right shoulder. No moments passed before many another hound leaped on to the unicorn, each with a chosen grip, for all that they looked like a rabble rolling and heaving by chance. Orion thrust no more, for many hounds all at once were between him and his enemy's throat. Awful groans came from the unicorn, such sounds as are not heard in the fields we know. And then there was no sound but the deep growl of the hounds that roared over the wonderful carcass as they wallowed in fabulous blood.